Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here today. And it was a pleasure listening to you, John. It was a pleasure particularly to see that these ideas sort of reach out. In my days at Brown, it was only Robinson Hall that actually represented this kind of thinking. And Robinson Hall, which houses the economics department at Brown, which sort of was an enclave in an ocean of social democracy. But it's good to see that ideas of economic freedom and of social justice are actually contagious, and that they spread in a way which I'm sure most of us agree with. I agree with your thinking a lot. I've read your book, and I will try to address a question. It's a great book. I'll try to address a slightly different question, which again is more central to the theme which I debate myself in the book I wrote recently. And that is the question of how might we get there? How do we get there, or how might we get to a society which is at the same time more free, perhaps more efficient, and more just? Because that, to me, is another important question. I start from the point of enumerating, I think, 3 different ways of running organizations. We have organizations that are run by hierarchy, by command, if you wish. We are organizations and societies that are run by voting, by majority voting, democracy, if you wish. And we have organizations and systems that are run by markets, i.e. we can allocate resources either by command, by vote, or by market. These 3 systems of creating human organization are all associated with some pros and some cons. And that's why they all run in parallel. If you think about it, our society is composed of organizations that are run by hierarchy. Typically, we call them firms. Typically, companies, firms, are run hierarchically. They're led by a CEO with wide powers. His decisions cannot really be questioned, and nobody basically votes. I mean, you Swedes always think people vote on boards. People do not vote on boards, okay? So the firm, largely, is the most typical example of a hierarchy. Now, hierarchy obviously has a big problem, and I don't have to remind many of you of the problems of hierarchy, because we've seen some very bad applications of hierarchy in Europe in particular. We, who have not been protected by writing as great as Thomas Jefferson's in the American Constitution, we have been open to other interpretations of how you should organize human beings, and this has been particularly prevalent amongst the Germans, who have experienced more or less every possible form of stupid hierarchical organization that you can think of. So hierarchy has this problem that it requires a mechanism to sort of prevent it from going sort of totally berserk. And typically, the one mechanism that prevents it from going berserk is exit. And this will be a key theme in what I will be saying going forward. You see, in a company, anyone can exit. A worker can just say, keep your goddamn company, I'm out of here, I'm going to work for the competition. A shareholder can just call his broker and sell this crappy stock, I don't like this company anymore. So when everybody can exit and enter, you can actually have hierarchy. But if you can't exit and enter, hierarchy is a bad idea, okay? So mostly hierarchy is a bad idea in societies because we don't really enter and exit our societies yet, okay? Now, markets are probably the most excellent way of running things for one simple reason. Markets don't really force anyone to do anything. Markets have the wonderful property that it will leave the ones who do not agree free to do whatever they want to do. In a market, nobody forces himself on anyone else. Everyone decides for himself, buys, sells, allocates, whatever. Now, this doesn't mean markets are completely free of problems, because obviously there are some things that can't be dealt with by markets. There's a long literature on that. I mean, there are things we have to do together. We probably mostly have to defend ourselves together. We have to create a society that allocates some things we typically call public goods. And I actually agree with John. We need to create some form of social insurance, some safety net. I perhaps differ a little with John with European experience. I'm a bit more worried about the incentive structures of those nets, but I understand that's not your philosophical question. I think we agree on the broad point that there has to be a safety net to create social justice, but it is not an unproblematic proposal. And of course, there is also an argument to be made for some income redistribution, believe it or not. There is no natural market-defined income distribution. That can easily be proved. And therefore, those extreme libertarians that would argue that there is a unique market-defined distribution of income really don't have the moral high ground. Still, that's a far cry from accepting social democratic redistribution policies. Finally, we have democracy. Now, we in Scandinavia, perhaps you in Sweden in particular, tend to think that democracy really is the highest achievement of humanity. That ultimately, voting is the morally most correct way of deciding. Now, this is fascinating because there's an enormous literature on the problems of majority voting, starting with religious leaders who just warn us that, are we morally sure that what the majority wants is actually right? There's any number of examples from history of how majorities, smaller or larger, have actually used that power in a morally despicable way, submitting minorities to this or that injustice or worse. The whole premise that a majority somehow is right is rejected by virtually every philosopher, starting with John Rawls, since this is a name that was already mentioned, and actually it goes through the whole school of philosophy. There is no moral basis for the fact that 51% is per definition right. Now, but that is not the only problem. It turns out that voting about things is a very, very inefficient way of deciding. And now I'm not using the efficient word in the strict normal economic sense. Voting transmits very little information. Now, if you don't understand exactly what that means, let me briefly explain that to you. There is something called the arrow impossibility theorem from 1950, the extremely famous economist Kenneth Arrow, who was amongst the very first Nobel Prize winners in economics. Arrow actually proved, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that under some fairly general conditions, under some fairly general presumptions in economics, there is no way to transform the preferences of a group of voters into social choice in a way that would not violate Pareto optimality. Now, that may sound like gibberish to you, but what it means is that there is no way of actually creating a value-free redistribution of income with a majoritarian voting system. Again, it may be gibberish. It is a generalization of many results in economic theory or in political theory, all pointing to a very simple fact. Simply saying yes or no or voting at a booth transports very little information. Now, let me give you examples and you perhaps understand what I mean. And I will refer primarily to two special problems. One is the problem of the median voter. Now, in virtually any income distribution, the median voter will earn less than the average. So you will always find, in virtually any income distribution, 51% of the voters supporting further income redistribution. You can always find a majority that will vote for higher taxes because it is in their interest. Now, that in itself is an interesting aspect, but I don't think actually it's the most important aspect. I think the most important aspect is simply that as human beings, we don't really feel as strongly about a number of things. There may easily be shown to exist a small majority, a thin majority for some proposal which this majority feels is, okay, it's nice, but it's not really important. And then there's a big minority which says, hell no, never. This is catastrophic. Now, actually, this is very typical for tax legislation. It's very typical for the debate on the financial transactions tax, which we are debating now in Europe, that there is a majority that says, yeah, well, it's bank bashing, it's good, let's have it. And then there's a small minority which says this is catastrophic. You can think about nuclear power, you can think about a number of questions of social justice, and you will actually see that it's very typical that you have majorities who don't feel very strongly about it, but say, okay, this is a good idea to have, and minorities who feel very strongly. Now, how should you compare that? Is it really right that 51% who say, yeah, probably it's a good idea, should win over 49% who say, hell no, this is a catastrophe? Of course, it's not necessarily right. Because if they were able to trade in a market, the 49% would be willing to pay an enormous amount of money for not getting this thing through. Whereas the 51% who felt it was a marginal idea anyway are not willing to pay very much to have their way. So democracy and voting is also combined with a hell of a lot of problems. It's not simply so that majorities can always rule and always arrive at the best possible conclusion. This is why in history there's been written pages and pages on how to rein in majoritarian voting in order to create a just society. Actually, the American Constitution deals mostly with specifically this problem, how to prevent majorities from misusing their powers. And this is a very, very crucial question on our way towards a juster society. This problem is recognized by virtually every writer, from de Tocqueville in the 1830s all the way to James Buchanan. It's even recognized, as I said, by John Rawls. De Tocqueville actually drew the first conclusion in his book. I mean, the whole idea with his travel to America in the 1820s was, as a French aristocrat, to arrive in America to study how the hell can democracy work when there is no aristocracy to say, you can't do that, or sort of use a veto power. And actually, de Tocqueville writes, he writes 2 complete volumes about this, and he's very worried about this problem. He tries to find an aristocracy, and he doesn't. And he comes up with the somewhat cockamamie conclusion that the lawyers should be the new aristocracy of the United States, which, of course, we all know would probably be absolutely catastrophic. But he points, and actually the concept which is in the headline of my book, The Tyranny of the Majority, actually comes from de Tocqueville, because he speaks about the tyranny of the majority much the same way as I talked about it a moment ago. Now, there are other solutions. James Buchanan, the Nobel laureate, suggests supermajorities. He essentially suggests that we should never decide on social and public issues except by big majorities, almost going to unanimity. We should ask for 90% majorities. Now, it's a nice idea, and it has much going for it, but it's not practical. Because the greater the majority, the greater the weight of the minority. And again, you can end up in a crazy situation where small minorities get an enormous influence over the political process. We've seen that in Europe. We see that in special processes within our corporate structures and elsewhere. Buchanan himself gave up on the idea also about 25 years after writing about it. Supermajorities work, but only in a limited sense. They do not work in the way James Buchanan suggested. Now, the American Constitution actually offers some of the best answers. The American Constitution first offers bicameralism, something we had here in Scandinavia, 2 chambers of parliament, a Senate with longer election periods, longer mandates, with senior statesmen who basically say, no, freshmen, you can't do these stupid things, and sort of trying to hold back on the populism prevalent in the lower chamber. This is something you had until 1974 here in Sweden, one of the last sort of bicameral legislatures in the world of its form. There are, of course, many bicameral legislations left. Most importantly, the American Congress, which still is bicameral in the same way as it was instituted, and is actually one of the very few examples where it works very well, since the Senate is not hereditary, it's not appointed, it's elected, it's wholly legitimate, but it creates a structure with a power and a countervailing power that works rather well. Secondly, the United States has a presidential veto. The president can simply, by one legal action, raise the limit of a voting in Congress from a 50% majority to a 2/3 supermajority. That's essentially the veto, because the Congress can override the president with a 2/3 majority. And of course, the Americans have judicial review, which was not explicitly written into the Constitution. That is the great power of the courts to actually rule on the constitutionality of what the politicians decide. All these things are instituted to limit majoritarian rule. And this is very important morally to understand. We need limitations on the right of majorities to use their powers. Because if we don't have those limitations, we get the society, which I now say, and please don't take offense, which Olof Palme wanted to create. We need limitations on the rights of majorities, of particularly thin majorities, to rule over minorities, because otherwise we will create a monster. To sum up this part, and then go to some conclusions, I think we actually in Europe need much more markets, and we need less majoritarian decisions making. I completely agree with John Tomasi that we need to set up a system that is able to create a safety net. And that, of course, system has to be run democratically. We need to allow for the kind of processes that we presently have to run that system. But on the other hand, I'm a strong believer, as he is, in economic liberties and in the importance of leaving more decisions to be made by markets, where they are made more justly, more efficiently, and more liberally. I also think democracy itself, particularly in Europe, is in crisis. I write quite a lot about the European Union, and while not having time to really go into that here now, I think we need to raise a red flag and say we can't go on like this. That's worth a separate seminar. Now, the key point of all of this is, of course, the question, how do our societies work and how will we go on from here? It's very interesting to see that we are in the midst of a very interesting process, which I have referred to as voting with our feet. And nowhere is this process more obvious than in Europe today. It's fascinating that as long as the power to tax was deemed sufficient by financial markets to uphold the credit quality of sovereign nations, this system worked. But the moment when financial markets realized that the constitutional right to tax does not automatically mean a political will to tax and to pay back your debts, the process changed. And all of a sudden, we have ended up in a situation where democracy no longer is invincible. Actually, we have introduced a new criterion to European democracy, which I have referred to as a sustainability criterion. If democracies cannot pay their bills, they can no longer be democracies. This is not me talking. These are the financial markets reacting. What is happening in Europe at this moment is that countries that have been subject to an unwise tyranny of the majority, that have become overtaxed, overspent, and perhaps overcorrupt, are being taken over by an external force. That external force is a market force. It is the international financial market, which is basically saying, enough, you can't go on like this. This is a fascinating process, which I actually think will go on. I think financial markets will become the guardians of true democracy. I think financial markets will become the limiting constraint for the tyranny of the majority. And more so, I actually think that it will provide for a new market of sorts, and this is my ultimate argument. The new open world in which we live, where cost of transportation is lower than ever before, where information about life elsewhere is better than ever before, where language skills, communication skills, the internet make it extremely easy to do anything from searching for information to reserving, booking a hotel room elsewhere, will create an environment where migration will become much more important as an economic force. We already see this on the corporate level. You are just in the process of lowering your corporate tax to 22%. I don't know if you're aware of what debate that has created in Finland, because obviously this is seen as a competitive move. And obviously we are all getting involved in what will become a global competition for economic circumstances of life, because people and corporations will be looking for the best place to live. Now, obviously, ultimately, that will not be a process limited to just taxation. It will be a process that will engulf every aspect of social life. We will move towards a world where we will get a new market of sorts, not a particularly efficient one. It's really not a very efficient market, but it's still a market where you and I and everyone else can choose our ideal society. We will have answered some of the great questions from John Locke to Alexis de Tocqueville and many others by saying, let's leave it to choice. Let's allow nations, let's allow constitutions, let's allow tax systems and social security systems to compete for membership, just like simple institutions in the economic sphere do every day. And now, for the shock, of course, this is not a new idea. Ayn Rand had this in 1957 when she wrote Atlas Shrugged, because that's what Atlas Shrugged is all about. It's about the most productive members of the society saying, enough, I won't take this anymore. This tyranny of the majority is simply too much for me. I'm out of here. And then if you remember the last pages of the book, which I quote in my book, they eventually return. And that's where the story ends. My story doesn't end there. I actually think we're going, or our children, or at least our grandchildren. I have 3 grandchildren, that I'm very proud of. Perhaps their world will be a better world. A world of market democracy, of social justice, not of the social democratic kind, but of a kind chosen by people who freely choose one system over another. That is real democracy, that is real liberty. Thank you.
Let me ask you a very general question with a short answer. I mean, the crisis we see here in Europe, you basically indicate that it's a crisis of the European social model and the majoritarian type of democracy we see in Europe, and it's not a crisis of the market. Is that correct? Or do financial markets have they failed as well in this process?
No.
Okay.
And let me just very briefly expand on that. The problem with our European banks is really that all the politically led banks are now bankrupt. The well-run market-based banks are doing just fine. The problem with our social model is that, if you remember an economist called Arthur Laffer with the Laffer curve, you remember the relationship between tax revenue and tax rate. Every economist around agrees that we are somewhere very near the top of the Laffer curve with our 50% tax rates in Europe. Now, what that means is that the Laffer, since we have deficits, it means that the Laffer curve does not reach the expenditure level. There's no way of solving the European problem by increasing taxation, because it will not create more tax revenue. The only way is cutting back on expenditure.
So, please, and present yourself.
Thank you, Björn, for a very inspiring presentation. I would like you to ask you about one thing that you didn't mention, and that was not in the previous presentation either, and it had to do with your closing when you referred to your grandchildren, and that is a time dimension. We were there, both of us, in the 1960s when there was a revolt and people started to talk about direct democracy. There should be no limitations on those being there for the time being to make the decisions. Now we are talking a little about sustainability. What is your experience and what is your comment to how do we get into the picture the obligation towards the coming ones? The market may be a good barrier against faulty decisions, the financial markets, but it takes more, I guess, to have the creative decisions.
Very good. Please.
Actually, I disagree with your conclusion. The question is an excellent one. First, let me briefly say, that was actually, you're very good in saying that in the 60s we thought about near democracy and everything. Actually, what we were libertarians. We actually wanted to create freedom for every little group that wanted to act somewhere, and actually for every individual. And then somehow it went haywire and became the welfare state. I don't really know how, but it was a disaster. Now, on your specific question on what economists call the time preference for consumption, i.e. how resources will be allocated over time, whether we will be consuming, which financial markets make possible, consuming from our grandchildren, or whether we will be leaving stuff for our grandchildren. Actually, let me just give you an empirical conclusion. Financial markets never steal from the future. That is always done by someone who deliberately designs to steal from the future. Financial markets offer the opportunity to invest in the future, i.e. to move resources from today through investing into the future. But of course, they also create a mechanism whereby you can move resources from the future until today. Now, if you look at what has actually happened, think of yourself as individuals. What have you done in financial markets? Well, I'll bet you that almost all of you have actually invested for the future. I mean, you probably, at least the ones who are up in my generation, probably have more assets in the future than we have debts in the future. Now, who is the one? Who's the one who creates this problem? Why are we worried about the future of our grandchildren? Well, it's because we have this one joint organization called the state or the public sector, which is deeply, deeply in debt in the future. The Norwegians are not as much because they happen to own this goddamn oil. But the rest of us, and you Swedes a little less, even we Finns a little less than most Europeans. But if you look to the great European nations, it is the uncontrolled tyranny of the majority of those states that has actually, in order to try to support itself, even when it has become otherwise financially very difficult, it has tried to support itself by borrowing and ultimately stealing from future generations.